My name is Aurora. I'm in my late 30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in rooms where decisions are made quietly, conference rooms with glass walls, calendars that decide priorities, and email threads where tone matters more than truth. I've never been the loudest person in those rooms. I've rarely been the one people expect to shape the outcome. And that assumption about who I am and what I would tolerate sat at the center of everything that happened next. People tend to describe me as calm, dependable, low friction, the kind of person you can put anywhere and not worry about. There's a compliment hidden in that, but there's also a dismissal. Calm is often mistaken for compliant. Quiet gets confused with absence. And when you live inside that misunderstanding long enough, others begin to build expectations around it, expectations that benefit them far more than you. This is not a story about revenge. There are no villains twirling mustaches, no dramatic walkouts, no shouting matches in executive offices. What I'm about to share is slower than that, colder, more ordinary. It's about what happens when someone is underestimated for a long time and chooses not to correct that assumption out loud. The events of this story unfolded over months, not days. They began with small things that were easy to dismiss and ended with consequences no one saw coming. Somewhere in the middle, a line was crossed quietly, not with raised voices, but with a suggestion that was never written down. A meeting that was never supposed to exist, and a refusal that changed how I was treated overnight. You might recognize parts of this if you've ever been the reliable one. The person whose competence made others comfortable pushing boundaries, assuming flexibility, and assuming silence. You might also recognize the feeling of being told, without being told, that your presence was conditional. What follows is my honest account of how I moved through that moment, how silence became a choice, how preparation replaced reaction, and how power doesn't always announce itself when it shifts. I'm telling this story not to stir outrage, but to document something real. How systems respond when someone quietly steps out of the role assigned to them. There is no exaggeration here, no fantasy justice. Just sequence, cause and effect, and the strange clarity that comes when you stop trying to be understood by people who benefit from misunderstanding you. Before we go any further, let me ask you something, gently and without judgment. Have you ever felt the ground shift under your feet, not because you made a scene, but because you didn't? I was never the face of the room. In meetings, I sat slightly to the side, not because anyone told me to, but because no one told me not to. I took notes that others didn't think to take. I followed up on loose ends that made everyone else look efficient. When something went wrong, I was often the one who knew why. When something went right, I was rarely mentioned at all. To them, I was continuity, the person who stayed when others rotated out, the one who remembered how a decision had been made 3 years ago and why it couldn't simply be undone with a new executive's enthusiasm. I knew the systems, the people, the quiet compromises that kept things moving. That knowledge made me useful, but not visible in the way power usually recognizes. I didn't mind that at first. There's a particular safety in being underestimated. No one watches you too closely. No one feels threatened. You're trusted with details but excluded from intention. People speak freely around you because they don't imagine you changing the outcome, only smoothing it. So that became my place. I was the one people turned to after decisions were announced, not before. The one asked to make it work rather than asked what would work best. When priorities conflicted, I was expected to absorb the friction. When timelines were unrealistic, I was expected to adjust them quietly. I did, for a long time. Not out of fear, not even out of ambition. I stayed because I believed competence had a gravity of its own, that eventually consistency would be recognized as leadership. That if I stayed measured and fair, the room would recalibrate around me. That belief kept me steady. It also kept me still. Looking back, I can see how clearly I had been categorized, not as expendable, but as adaptable. Someone whose boundaries were assumed to be flexible because they had never been tested publicly. Someone who wouldn't make things awkward. Someone who would handle discomfort privately. I didn't correct that assumption. Not because I agreed with it, but because correcting it would have required heat. And heat in those rooms was always punished more than quiet erosion. So I stayed calm, professional, unreactive. When people interrupted me, I finished my sentences anyway, later in writing. When my ideas resurfaced with someone else's name attached, I let the moment pass. When meetings were scheduled without me and I was asked to implement decisions I hadn't weighed in on, I asked clarifying questions and moved forward. From the outside, it probably looked like confidence. From the inside, it felt like being carefully edited out of my own role. But here's the part that matters. I was listening the entire time. I noticed who deferred to whom. Who avoided putting things in writing? Which conversations happened in hallways instead of calendars? I noticed which rules were rigid and which ones bent quietly when it suited the right person. And I noticed something else too. No one ever asked what I wanted. They assumed alignment because I never disrupted momentum. They assumed loyalty because I never complained. They assumed consent because I never said no. That assumption would hold, right up until it didn't. At that stage, I didn't know where the line was yet. I only knew that, whatever it was, it hadn't been crossed loudly. It would arrive the way most things did in that environment, casually, politely, and framed as reasonable. And when it did, they would expect the same version of me to receive it. They had no idea how much I had already seen. The first time it happened, it didn't feel important enough to name. It was a calendar adjustment, one of those quiet edits that slips in without explanation. A meeting I'd been part of for months was rescheduled, and my name simply wasn't there anymore. No note, no follow-up, just absence. I assumed it was a mistake. I asked the coordinator, casually, if the invite had changed. She apologized, re-added me, and said it must have been an oversight. That word again. Oversight. As if attention itself were an optional resource. The meeting went on as usual. I contributed. No one acknowledged the gap. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. A few weeks later, a document circulated, one I had originally drafted. My name wasn't on it. Instead, it arrived polished, finalized, with a senior manager's signature at the bottom. The language was mine. The structure is unmistakable. But the ownership had shifted so cleanly, it looked intentional. I hesitated before saying anything. Not because I doubted myself, but because I understood the social math. Calling it out would make me look territorial, sensitive, uncollaborative. The very traits I had spent years avoiding. So I let it pass, telling myself that impact mattered more than credit. That's how small cuts work. They don't announce themselves as harm. They arrive as inconveniences, as misunderstandings, as social misalignments that are easier to swallow than to challenge. I swallowed this one too. The next cut came in conversation. We were discussing a project that had stalled. The room was restless, impatient for resolution. Someone turned to me and said, "You're good at fixing things like this. Can you just handle it? Just not lead it, not define the approach, just handle it." As if the complexity of the problem were matched by the simplicity of my role. I nodded. Of course I did. But something registered then. Not anger, not even hurt. Recognition. I was being relied on in ways that limited me. Trusted with execution, excluded from authority, valued for my steadiness, not my judgment. And the people around me didn't see this as an imbalance. To them, it was efficiency. Everyone else ignored these moments because they benefited from them. Because friction slowed things down. Because someone like me made it unnecessary to examine how work and power were actually distributed. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't change my tone. I didn't document the slight. I just remembered it. I started noticing patterns instead of incidents. How often my involvement began after decisions were made, how often my contributions were described as support, never strategy. How often was my availability assumed without being asked, These weren't accidents, they were calibrations. And the most important thing about the first small cut is this: it teaches you how others will treat the next one. It shows you the shape of the boundary they believe exists, even if you've never drawn it. At that point, I still believed I could redraw it gently. If I kept doing excellent work, the shape would change on its own. I hadn't yet learned that systems rarely correct what quietly serves them, so I stayed composed, reliable, present, and I paid attention. Disrespect doesn't arrive as a single moment you can point to. It settles in slowly, the way background noise does. At first, you notice it, then you adjust to it. Eventually, you stop distinguishing it from the environment itself. That's what happened next. The exclusions became subtle enough to defend. A pre-meeting without me here, a decision already in motion there. I would hear about things after the fact, usually framed as time-sensitive or already agreed upon. The language was always reasonable. No one was rude. No one raised their voice. And because it was reasonable, I reasoned with myself. I told myself it wasn't personal, that leadership teams needed space to think out loud, that my role was operational by design, that not every conversation needs every voice. All of that was true, and all of it was incomplete. What I didn't say out loud, what I barely admitted to myself, was how consistently I was expected to adapt. How often I was the one smoothing the edges others created, how rarely anyone asked whether those edges needed to exist at all. When timelines were compressed, I absorbed the pressure. When expectations shifted, I recalibrated quietly. When someone else missed a detail, I caught it without comment. The reward for this was more responsibility, never more authority. That dynamic was never negotiated. It was inferred. People began to speak around me instead of to me. Not disrespectfully, just efficiently. They would reference decisions in shorthand, assuming I already knew or didn't need to. My presence became functional rather than participatory, and still I stayed. Part of that was professional pride. I didn't want to be the person who made things harder by insisting on recognition. I believed good work spoke for itself. I believed consistency earned trust. Another part was conditioning. When you've been the calm one for long enough, you start managing other people's comfort instinctively. You anticipate how your reactions will land. You soften your language before anyone asks. You choose silence not because you have nothing to say, but because you understand the cost of saying it. I told myself I was choosing the bigger picture. What I was actually doing was normalizing a pattern that made it easier to bypass me. The clearest example came during a planning cycle that should have involved me from the start. Instead, I was looped in after the strategy was set, asked to sense-check decisions that were already communicated externally. When I pointed out risks, real ones, documented ones, I was thanked for my diligence and told they'd be managed. No one asked me how. No one paused the rollout. Later, when those risks materialized, I was asked to help fix the fallout. I did. That was the moment I realized something uncomfortable. My silence was being interpreted as consent. Not enthusiastic consent, but functional acceptance. The kind that allows others to keep operating without self-reflection. Still, I didn't confront anyone. Not because I was afraid, but because I was watching. I wanted to understand the system before I challenged it. I wanted to know whether this was a blind spot or a design. And I began to see that the system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as intended for the people who benefited from my quiet compliance. The most dangerous part of normalized disrespect is how invisible it becomes to everyone except the person carrying it. Others see stability, they see reliability, they see someone who doesn't mind. What they don't see is the accumulation. The way each small dismissal recalibrates what's acceptable next. By the time I noticed how much ground I had given, the line had moved far enough that stepping back would no longer look neutral. It would look like resistance, and resistance in environments like that is rarely forgiven. So I stayed still, and I kept notes. It took me longer than it should have to name the role they had given me. Not my title. That was clear enough on paper. What took time to understand was the emotional function I served inside the system. the unspoken expectations, the shape I was meant to hold so others could move freely. I was the stabilizer, the person who absorbed uncertainty so it didn't ripple upward, the one who translated chaos into order without drawing attention to the mess. When something was sensitive, I was trusted to handle it discreetly. When something was urgent, I was expected to be available. When something was inconvenient, I was expected to be flexible, reliable, useful, invisible. No one ever said this out loud. They didn't need to. The pattern enforced itself. When leadership wanted reassurance, they came to me privately. When they wanted consensus, they spoke publicly without me. My presence was welcome in execution, optional in direction. I wasn't excluded because I lacked capability. I was excluded because including me would have complicated things. I asked questions that slowed momentum. I remembered past decisions that contradicted present enthusiasm. I noticed trade-offs others preferred to minimize. So they learned how to work around me without appearing to. What made this especially difficult was that I was good at the role. Exceptionally good. I could hold tension without leaking it. I could deliver difficult news without dramatizing it. I could make systems run smoothly even when they were poorly designed. And every time I did, it reinforced the idea that I belonged exactly where I was. The role became self-justifying. I started to see how often my calm was used as cover, how my presence allowed others to take risks without accountability because someone would be there to catch the consequences, how my discretion made it easier for conversations to stay undocumented, decisions to stay informal. That's when I understood the trade I had been making. I was exchanging visibility for safety, influence for stability, authority for trust. And the problem with that trade is not that it's inherently wrong, it's that it's rarely renegotiated in your favor. Once people rely on you to be the quiet one, they resist any version of you that isn't. I noticed it the first time I pushed back gently. It wasn't dramatic. I simply asked to be included earlier in a decision that affected my area. The response was polite, even warm, but non-committal. Of course, they said, we'll loop you in next time. Next time never came. Instead, I felt a subtle cooling, fewer informal check-ins, less context shared. Not as punishment, more as reclassification, as if I had momentarily stepped out of character and the system was correcting for it. That reaction told me everything I needed to know. My value was conditional. Not on performance, I delivered consistently, but on predictability, on staying within the emotional boundaries assigned to me. I didn't feel angry about that. I felt clear. Clarity has a way of quieting noise. It strips away the stories you tell yourself to stay comfortable. It shows you the role you're playing and asks a simple question. Do you consent to this continuing? At that point, I still hadn't answered it, but I stopped trying to earn a different role through effort alone. I stopped believing that excellence would automatically translate into agency. I stopped assuming that patience would be rewarded. Instead, I began to observe my position as if it belonged to someone else, to see how easily I could be moved and how much others relied on the fact that I wouldn't move myself. They thought they knew who I was. What they didn't realize was that the role they had assigned me required my cooperation to function. And cooperation, once withdrawn, changes everything. The shift didn't happen in a meeting. There was no confrontation, no raised voice, no moment anyone else would recognize as significant. If you were looking for drama, you would have missed it entirely. It happened on a Tuesday morning, alone at my desk, with a calendar open in front of me. A meeting invite had appeared overnight, no agenda, no dial-in link, just a time, a location, and 2 names, mine and his. The location wasn't our office. It was a hotel across town, one I recognized because leadership sometimes stayed there during conferences. At first, I assumed it was a mistake. I refreshed the page, checked my email. There was no explanation, no message attached. Just the invite, sitting there with the casual confidence of something that was expected to be accepted without question. I didn't feel afraid. I didn't feel flattered. What I felt was a sudden, sharp alignment of all the patterns I had been observing for months. This was the line. Not because of the hotel exactly, but because of the assumptions embedded in the choice. The belief that my discretion extended beyond professional boundaries, that my silence could be relied upon not just for work, but for comfort, that I would handle this privately, quietly, and without complication. I closed the calendar. I didn't decline immediately. I didn't respond at all. I let the stillness stretch long enough for me to listen to what I was feeling without rushing to manage anyone else's reaction. There was no confusion, no internal debate. I knew exactly what refusing would cost me, and I knew exactly what accepting would cost me more. So I declined the invite. No explanation, no counterproposal, just a clean, unadorned no. I went back to work. The rest of the day passed without incident. No follow-up message, no acknowledgement. If anything, the silence felt deliberate, as if the moment would be erased if it wasn't named. The next morning, I logged in and found an email waiting for me. I was being placed on administrative leave effective immediately. Access suspended, equipment to be returned. Someone from HR would be in touch. No reason given. I sat with that for a long time. Not because I was shocked, but because I was struck by how quickly the system recalibrated once I stepped out of role. The calendar invite disappeared. My role did not. That was the moment I understood the depth of the miscalculation. They believed my value was contingent on my compliance, that my presence was optional once I stopped being convenient, that removing me would restore equilibrium. What they didn't account for was everything that lived quietly in my absence. I didn't panic. I didn't send a flurry of messages. I didn't defend myself to people who had already made their choice. I did one thing only. I opened my notebook, and for the first time, I wasn't recording to help the system function. I was documenting to understand how it would respond when it no longer had me smoothing the edges. The shift wasn't emotional. It was structural. Administrative leave creates a strange kind of quiet. Your days are suddenly unstructured. The constant low-level urgency disappears. No messages to triage, no meetings to prepare for. Just time and the echo of what's been left unsaid. At first, I treated the silence the way I always had, as something to manage carefully. I resisted the impulse to explain myself, to clarify, to soften what had happened. I knew how quickly narratives form in the absence of information, and how tempting it is to rush in and shape them. This time I didn't. Silence, for once, was mine to choose. HR reached out within 48 hours. The language was neutral, procedural. They framed the leave as precautionary, temporary. There were no accusations, no details, just process. I listened. I answered questions directly. I volunteered nothing. That restraint surprised even me. For years, I had filled gaps instinctively, offering context before it was requested. Now, I let the questions stand on their own. I noticed how often they circled around the missing piece without naming it. I wasn't being evasive, I was being precise. What became clear very quickly was that my absence created friction no one had anticipated. Processes stalled. Decisions that relied on my institutional memory slowed down. People reached out, not directly, but through intermediaries, asking where things stood, how certain systems worked. I didn't respond. Not out of spite, but because I had been instructed not to. And because, for the first time, I wasn't going to correct the consequences of a choice I hadn't made. In the office, my silence was interpreted as weakness. I would learn later that some assumed I was embarrassed. Others thought I was scared. A few believed I'd quietly resigned to avoid scrutiny. The assumptions were familiar and useful. They bought me time. Time to review the documentation I already had. Time to map decision paths. Time to understand exactly how exposed the organization was to the knowledge they had allowed to concentrate quietly in one person. Me. I began to see the irony clearly. For years, I had been considered low risk because I didn't demand attention. Now, my absence revealed just how much risk had been deferred onto me without acknowledgement. Silence sharpened my thinking. Without the need to manage relationships or soothe egos, I could assess the situation cleanly. I could see where policies were vague, where procedures relied on trust rather than clarity, and where assumptions had replaced safeguards. Most importantly, I could see how the narrative was being shaped without my participation, and for once, I let it. Silence stopped being something that happened to me. It became something I used deliberately, a way of allowing others to reveal their priorities without interference. I wasn't waiting to be rescued. I wasn't hoping for an apology. I wasn't even certain how this would end. What I was certain of was this: the version of me that rushed to stabilize discomfort was gone. In her place was someone willing to let the imbalance speak for itself. What they never noticed was how long I had been preparing without knowing that I was. For years, my role had required precision. I tracked decisions because no one else wanted to. I saved versions of documents because people changed their minds. I kept records not out of suspicion, but out of habit. When something mattered, I wrote it down. When something felt unclear, I followed up in writing. At the time, it felt like diligence. In hindsight, it was infrastructure. During my leave, I began organizing what I already had, not emotionally, methodically. I laid out timelines. I cross-referenced meeting notes with final decisions. I reviewed approvals that had never been formally recorded, expectations that had been implied but never defined. A pattern emerged quickly. So many processes relied on my memory that no one had ever considered what would happen without it. Policies existed, but their interpretation lived in emails, side conversations, and informal understandings I had quietly maintained. I didn't create this dependence intentionally. It grew because I was trusted and because I never made that trust visible. That invisibility had protected me once. Now it gave me leverage. I noticed how often I had been asked to just handle things that technically required approval, how frequently my judgment had been substituted for governance, how casually boundaries were blurred in the name of efficiency. None of this was illegal, none of it was dramatic, but it was fragile, and fragility when exposed creates urgency. While others scrambled to reconstruct context, I stayed focused on accuracy. I didn't speculate. I didn't assume motive. I simply documented what existed and what didn't. What struck me most was how little of this was malicious. It was systemic, built on convenience, sustained by people like me who absorbed ambiguity so others didn't have to. That realization softened something in me. This wasn't about punishing anyone. It was about understanding the architecture I had been supporting and deciding whether I would continue to do so under the same terms. They never noticed my preparation because it had never been performative. I hadn't announced my competence. I hadn't claimed authority. I had just done the work, quietly. Now, that quiet had weight. I could feel it in the questions HR asked, in the careful phrasing, in the way conversation slowed once I asked for clarification instead of offering it preemptively. They were beginning to see the outline of a problem they hadn't known existed, and for the first time, I wasn't rushing to solve it for them. The realization didn't arrive with satisfaction. There was no rush, no sense of triumph, just a quiet, unmistakable clarity, the kind that settles in your body before it reaches your thoughts. I understood fully what leverage actually meant. Not power over people, not threats, not exposure. Leverage was simply the truth of how much the system relied on what I carried, and how little of that reliance had ever been formalized. I hadn't been hoarding information. I had been holding it in trust. And that trust had never been reciprocated with protection. During one of the HR follow-ups, I was asked, carefully, whether I had documentation related to certain processes. The question was framed as routine, but the hesitation underneath it was new. They were beginning to sense the gap. I answered honestly, yes, I did, and yes, I could provide it when appropriate. Not now. That boundary landed differently than anything I had said before. After that call, I sat with my notebook open and let the full picture come into focus. I traced how decisions moved, where accountability blurred, how often I had been positioned as a buffer between leadership intent and operational reality. I could see how easily the narrative could shift, how quickly the absence of clarity could become risk, not because I wanted it to, but because that's how systems behave when informal scaffolding is removed. And still, there was no urge to act quickly. Leverage doesn't require speed. It requires patience. What mattered most in that moment was not what I could do, but what I wouldn't. I wouldn't dramatize. I wouldn't threaten. I wouldn't collapse this into a personal grievance. This wasn't about a meeting invite anymore. It was about structure, about consent, about what happens when quiet labor is treated as infinite. The private reveal wasn't something I shared with anyone else. It was internal, a shift in how I understood my position. I wasn't waiting to be reinstated. I wasn't strategizing revenge. I was deciding calmly what kind of relationship I was willing to have with an institution that had shown me exactly how conditional my safety was. Once that decision begins to form, everything slows down. You stop reacting, you stop explaining, you stop volunteering pieces of yourself to systems that haven't earned them. And in that stillness, options appear. Clear ones, irreversible ones. There is a moment after clarity arrives when you have to decide what kind of person you are going to be next. Not publicly, internally. I laid out the options the way I always had, with distance, not emotion. I could cooperate fully, provide everything I had, help reconstruct the systems, make myself indispensable again. That path was familiar. It would likely lead to reinstatement, quiet appreciation, and a return to the role I had always played, perhaps with a few temporary concessions as a gesture of goodwill. I could resign. Step away cleanly, let the story end with ambiguity, and preserve my personal peace at the cost of an unfinished truth. Or I could choose a third path, one that required patience, boundaries, and a willingness to let discomfort exist without rushing to resolve it. That was the irreversible one. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't even defiant. It was simply a refusal to re-enter the system under the same assumptions that had allowed this to happen. I consulted a lawyer, not to threaten, but to understand, to map rights, obligations, and exposure. I asked careful questions. I listened more than I spoke. What emerged was confirmation of what I already sensed. The situation had been mishandled. The process was thin. The optics mattered more than the facts. And yet I felt no urgency to force a conclusion. At the decision point, what mattered most was alignment. Between my actions and my values, between what I knew and what I was willing to tolerate. I chose to respond slowly, formally, in writing. I acknowledged receipt of communications. I confirmed availability within defined boundaries. I declined to speculate or resolve issues outside official channels. I stopped being flexible. That was the irreversible choice. Flexibility had always been my currency. Withdrawing it didn't feel dramatic, it felt honest, and honesty in systems built on convenience is disruptive. I could sense the shift immediately. The tone changed. Timelines stretched. Conversations that once flowed around me now stalled without my participation. No one accused me of anything. No one apologized either. They were waiting for me to blink. I didn't, because the decision wasn't about winning. It was about refusing to lose myself quietly again. Once that line is drawn, there's no stepping back without self-betrayal. And I wasn't willing to pay that price anymore. Once the decision was made, everything became very quiet. Not externally, emails still arrived, calendars still shifted, but internally. The noise that usually followed moments of conflict simply didn't. There was no spike of adrenaline, no urge to justify myself to imaginary critics, just a steady sense of direction. Moving in silence doesn't mean doing nothing. It means doing only what is necessary and nothing that feeds the wrong narrative. I began by tightening the perimeter of my life. I separated work from identity with a clarity I had never allowed myself before. I stopped checking my inbox compulsively. I created specific windows of time for responding to official correspondence and ignored everything else. I didn't vent to colleagues. I didn't explain my side to people who hadn't asked, and I noticed how few actually did. That too was information. Through my lawyer, I requested formal clarification of my status, the scope of the investigation, and the timeline. The language was precise, neutral, and almost boring. No emotion, no insinuation, just structure. Structure is unsettling to systems that rely on informality. I could feel the organization adjusting around that formality, like a body trying to compensate for a missing limb. Processes that had once flowed easily now required meetings, approvals, and documentation. Each request for clarity exposed how much had previously been handled through trust, specifically, trust placed in me without safeguards. Still, I didn't rush. Moving in silence meant letting time do some of the work. It meant allowing gaps to surface naturally instead of filling them. It meant resisting the reflex to be helpful. That was harder than I expected. Helpfulness had been my reflex for years. It had shaped my reputation, my relationships, my sense of worth. Removing it felt like standing still in the middle of a moving crowd. Awkward, exposed, but also powerful. As days turned into weeks, I became aware of subtle signals reaching me indirectly. A former peer asking a neutral question that wasn't really neutral. A senior leader suddenly remembered to include me on a thread. HR is circling back with clarifications that hadn't seemed urgent before. I responded only when required, and only with what was asked. No extra context, no anticipatory problem solving. The silence forced everyone else to do their own work. Behind the scenes, I was preparing not for battle, but for an outcome. I reviewed my finances carefully. I adjusted my spending, not out of fear, but out of independence. I updated my records, my portfolio, and my professional references. Quietly, I reminded myself that my future did not hinge on a single institution's approval. That knowledge changed my posture completely. When you are no longer afraid of losing what you have, you stop negotiating against yourself. I also began documenting something else. Not processes this time, but patterns. How communication shifted when pressure increased, who spoke through intermediaries, who avoided putting anything in writing, who suddenly became conciliatory without acknowledging why. None of it was dramatic, all of it was telling. At one point, I was asked, indirectly, whether I would be open to an informal conversation to help resolve things more quickly. The phrasing was careful, friendly, almost kind. I declined. Not because I was unwilling to talk, but because informal had always meant unprotected. It had always been where assumptions lived, where lines blurred. Silence, in contrast, kept lines sharp. The longer this went on, the more apparent it became that my absence wasn't just inconvenient, it was destabilizing. Not catastrophically so, but enough to be noticed, enough to generate quiet concern. Still, no one rushed to reinstate me, and I didn't ask to be. Moving in silence also meant accepting uncertainty without trying to control it. I didn't know how this would end. I didn't know what story others were telling themselves about me. I let that go. Control had never actually been mine in those narratives anyway. What was mine was my conduct. I stayed consistent, calm, documented. I didn't escalate. I didn't retreat. I occupied the space exactly as it was defined, and no more. And in doing so, I learned something that surprised me. Silence changes how people see themselves. Without my responsiveness, others had to confront their own gaps, their own reliance, their own decisions. I wasn't there to absorb friction anymore, so the friction moved elsewhere. I didn't celebrate that. I observed it. Power doesn't always come from action. Sometimes it comes from restraint, refusing to perform the role that makes everything easier for everyone else at your expense. By the time the next phase began, the ground had already shifted. Not because I pushed, because I didn't. Consequences rarely arrive with announcements. They don't begin with blame or confession. They begin with absence, with small delays, with questions that don't quite land where they're meant to. Mine began showing up in other people's schedules. Meetings that used to end on time began to run long. Decisions that once moved smoothly now stalled in review. Projects that had always felt under control started surfacing as risks in status reports. Not failures, just uncertainties. Enough to make people uneasy. At first, no one connected these shifts to me. They looked for other explanations. Market conditions, resource constraints, communication gaps, anything that preserved the idea that the system itself was sound. But systems have memory, even when people pretend they don't. I heard about it secondhand. A colleague mentioned that a rollout had been paused because no one could quite remember why it was structured that way. Another asked, almost casually, whether I had ever documented a particular workaround that suddenly mattered a great deal. I hadn't vanished. I had simply stopped compensating. And without that compensation, the weight is redistributed. What surprised me wasn't that problems emerged. It was how quickly people began to feel exposed, not morally, operationally. The confidence that had once carried decisions forward started to thin. Leadership didn't panic, not yet, but they became careful. Language shifted, emails grew longer, CC lists expanded. Where once there had been certainty, there was now phrasing like pending clarification and subject to review. These were the early signs. I remained silent, not passively, but deliberately. I responded when required. I documented every exchange. I noticed how often questions came framed as collaboration when they were really requests for restoration. They wanted the old equilibrium back. What they hadn't understood was that the equilibrium had depended on my willingness to absorb ambiguity without acknowledgement, and that willingness was gone. In one HR call, the tone changed almost imperceptibly. The representative began referencing organizational impact, not accusatory, concerned, as if naming the problem might make it manageable. I listened. I didn't rush to reassure them. Reassurance had always been my contribution. Withholding it wasn't cruelty. It was accuracy. I couldn't reassure them anymore because I no longer trusted the structure that required my reassurance. Meanwhile, the story circulating internally became increasingly abstract. Some framed my leave as a procedural anomaly, others hinted at miscommunication. A few speculated quietly that I had chosen to disengage. What no one said out loud, what no one wanted to confront, was that the system had over-relied on someone it never fully protected. Admitting that would require accountability, and accountability, like silence, changes power dynamics. So instead, they circled. I noticed who stopped reaching out entirely, who avoided my name in conversation, who suddenly became warm after months of distance. Each reaction revealed something. The most telling consequence wasn't disruption, it was discomfort. People were uncomfortable not knowing, not having access, not being able to rely on the person who usually filled gaps without asking for recognition. And discomfort has a way of spreading. By the time leadership formally acknowledged that my absence had created unexpected challenges, the challenges had already been felt. Deadlines slipped, confidence wavered. The quiet certainty that someone competent was always behind the scenes had evaporated. Still, no one apologized. That wasn't surprising. Apologies require clarity, and clarity would mean acknowledging how much had been taken for granted. I wasn't watching this unfold with satisfaction. I wasn't tallying losses. I was observing a system learning, slowly, reluctantly, what it had cost itself by assuming silence meant consent. The consequences had begun, and they were no longer mine to manage. Panic doesn't always look like urgency. Sometimes it looks like politeness is stretched too thin, like excessive gratitude, like a sudden interest in a process where none existed before. By the time anyone realized something was truly wrong, the window to quietly reset had already closed. The first sign was the shift from impact to risk. Words matter in organizations. Impact suggests inconvenience. Risk suggests exposure, liability, visibility beyond the room. Once that language appears, the tone changes, not emotionally but structurally. Meetings multiplied. Legal joined conversations that had previously lived comfortably inside operations. HR stopped asking exploratory questions and started confirming facts. Timelines that had once felt flexible hardened into requirements. And still, no one named the origin. They were trying to solve the problem without acknowledging its cause, trying to restore function without examining trust, trying to fix what broke without admitting how it had been built. That's when it became too late. Email arrived asking whether I would be willing to support a transition back, framed as an opportunity to reestablish alignment. The wording was careful. The intent was not. They wanted restoration without reckoning. I read it once, then again, then I closed it. Not because I was offended, but because the question assumed something that no longer existed. My willingness to return to a role defined by accommodation rather than agency. What they were offering wasn't a repair, it was a reversion. And reversion would require me to unsee what I had seen. Behind that message, I could feel the pressure building. Senior stakeholders are asking why clarity still hasn't been achieved. External commitments are tightening. The cost of uncertainty is becoming measurable. Someone had finally asked the question that mattered. Why does so much live with her? Once that question is asked, it can't be unheard. I was asked, formally this time, to provide documentation to assist with risk mitigation. The request acknowledged my contributions in a way no one ever had before. It also made clear how indispensable those contributions had been. I agreed, under conditions. Clear scope, written requests, defined timelines, no informal side conversations. The pause that followed was telling. They had hoped urgency would soften my boundaries, that pressure would accelerate cooperation. Instead, it hardened my clarity. This wasn't punishment. It wasn't leverage being wielded theatrically. It was simply the cost of delayed recognition. By the time leadership realized that flexibility had been a finite resource and that they had exhausted it, the structure had already shifted. Legal realities replaced social ones. Documentation replaced trust. Silence replaced assumption. And silence, unlike goodwill, does not replenish itself. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt resolved. There is a quiet grief in realizing that a place you invested in only recognizes your value when it can no longer access it freely. That recognition, when it comes too late, doesn't feel like validation. It feels like confirmation. They weren't trying to hurt me. They were trying to fix a system that had never planned for my autonomy. And once autonomy is exercised, it can't be politely returned. The meeting was scheduled 3 weeks in advance. That alone told me everything. In the past, anything involving me had been squeezed between other priorities. Quick check-ins, informal syncs, conversations designed to resolve discomfort quickly. This one was different. It had a formal title, a defined agenda, legal and HR both included. A neutral conference room booked for 2 hours. No hotel, no ambiguity. By the time it happened, the emotional charge had already burned off. What remained was residue, careful, contained, professional. I arrived early, not to make a statement, but because I always had. Old habits don't vanish overnight. I sat at the table and placed my notebook in front of me, closed. I didn't need to open it. Everything I needed was already organized, internally and on record. They entered one by one. Familiar faces, now more cautious. People who had once spoken freely around me are now choosing their words with care. No one smiled too broadly. No one avoided eye contact either. This wasn't a standoff. It was an accounting. The conversation began with acknowledgments of my tenure, my contributions, my professionalism. Each phrase landed neutrally, not soothing, not sharp. I listened without interrupting. Then came the explanation. They framed the administrative leave as procedural. The calendar invite was a misunderstanding. The response was an overcorrection made under pressure. No malicious intent, no personal judgment. I didn't challenge any of it. Correction wasn't my role anymore. When it was my turn to speak, I kept my voice even. Not cold, not warm, just accurate. I stated facts. I declined a meeting because it was inappropriate. I was placed on leave without explanation. My access was revoked. My role remained undefined. During that time, operational gaps emerged that clarified the scope of my responsibilities and the lack of formal protection around them. I paused. No one interrupted. I continued. I explained that my concern was not reputational, it was structural. That my work had been relied upon informally for years without boundaries or safeguards. That my silence had been interpreted as availability beyond professional consent. Still no heat. I wasn't accusing them of intent, I was describing the effect. That distinction mattered. When questions came, I answered them directly. I didn't speculate about motives. I didn't describe emotional impact unless asked. And even then, I spoke in terms of trust, not hurt. Trust is a language organizations understand. At one point, someone asked whether I felt the situation could have been handled differently. Yes, I said earlier. That was all. The room went quiet, not uncomfortably, but decisively. The kind of quiet that signals something has settled. They offered paths forward. Reinstatement with revised scope. A different role. A transition package framed as a mutual agreement. Each option was reasonable. Each option assumed I wanted to return to what had already shown its limits. I didn't decide in the room. I thanked them for the clarity. I asked for everything in writing. I set a date for a response. No one objected. As the meeting ended, something subtle shifted. Not relief, recognition. They were no longer speaking to the version of me who would absorb ambiguity to preserve harmony. They were speaking to someone who required structure to continue. That version of me was unfamiliar to them. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't confrontational. It was simply no longer available for assumption. When I left the building, I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished. Not with anger, with negotiation. The confrontation had happened without heat because heat was never the point. The point was clarity. And clarity, once spoken aloud, leaves no room for retreat. I didn't walk away from that meeting with a new title. I walked away with something far more permanent, a recalibrated sense of self. For a long time, I had confused composure with self-erasure. I believed that staying calm meant staying small, that professionalism required emotional compression, that dignity lives somewhere close to silence. What I understand now is that silence is only dignified when it is chosen freely, not when it is expected, relied upon, or exploited. Who I am now is not louder, not sharper, not harder. I am clearer. I no longer confuse being needed with being valued. I no longer mistake access for trust. I no longer offer my steadiness as a substitute for other people's responsibility. That shift didn't happen overnight. It unfolded in the weeks after the confrontation, when the urgency had passed and nothing was left to negotiate, when no one was watching closely anymore, when I had space to ask myself questions I had postponed for years. What do I do when I'm not stabilizing something? Who am I when no one needs me to make it easier? At first, the answers were uncomfortable. There was grief there. Not for the role itself, but for the version of me who believed that endurance was the same as integrity. Who thought that being indispensable would protect her? Who didn't realize that indispensability without boundaries is simply a quieter form of disposability? I let myself feel that grief without turning it into bitterness. That mattered, because bitterness keeps you tethered to the thing you've outgrown. Instead, I paid attention to what felt different in my body. The absence of constant vigilance. The way my thoughts no longer rehearse explanations. The way my calendar, once cleared, began to refill with things that didn't require permission. I noticed how my voice changed when I spoke about work now. Less justification, more precision, fewer qualifiers. I noticed how I asked for terms instead of approval, how I declined without apology. Not dramatically, naturally. I didn't burn bridges, I didn't publish a manifesto, I didn't make my departure symbolic. I made it accurate. Accuracy has become my new compass. I say what is true without embellishment. I ask for clarity without softening it to protect others' comfort. I engage where there is mutual respect, and I disengage where there is only expectation. What surprised me most was how many people responded to that version of me differently. Some grew distant. They preferred the old equilibrium, the version of me who made their lives easier without asking for much in return. Others leaned in. They recognized the shift immediately, not as aggression, but as presence. Those are the relationships I keep now. I don't center my identity around being the calm one anymore. Calm is not a personality trait, it's a state, and states can be exited. Who I am now is someone who understands that quiet does not mean compliant, that restraint is not the absence of power, that dominance does not require performance. It requires self-definition. I am still observant, still measured, still disciplined, but I am no longer invisible to myself. And that may be the most lasting outcome of all. There's a version of this story that would end with a clear win, a reinstatement, a public apology, a moment where everyone finally understands what they lost. That's the version people often expect when they hear about power shifting quietly. But that isn't the truth of how this ended. The truth is simpler and harder to dramatize. What I gained was not validation, it was alignment. I didn't walk away with the satisfaction of being proven right. I walked away knowing that I had stopped participating in my own diminishment, that I had drawn a boundary without turning it into a spectacle, that I had refused a private meeting, accepted the consequences, and discovered that those consequences revealed far more about the system than they did about me. The calendar invite disappeared. My role did not. It simply changed shape. For a long time, I believed that fairness would emerge naturally if I stayed steady enough. That integrity was something you earned quietly and cashed in later. What this experience taught me is that systems don't reward integrity by default. They accommodate it only when it's inconvenient to ignore. Silence is not neutral. When chosen intentionally, it can be a form of authority. When expected of you, it becomes a tool others use to keep things comfortable for themselves. The moral of this story is not speak up sooner or trust no one or play harder. Those lessons are too blunt, too easy. The real lesson is this: pay attention to the roles you are rewarded for playing, especially the ones that cost you the most and ask the least in return. If your calm is only valued when it makes others' lives easier, it is not being respected. It is being consumed. If your discretion is assumed rather than earned, it will eventually be tested. And if your boundaries only exist privately, someone will try to move them. You don't need to punish anyone to change that. You just need to stop cooperating with arrangements that require your silence to function. Quiet dominance isn't about control, it's about consent, about choosing where your energy goes, about understanding that you can withdraw participation without withdrawing dignity. I'm sharing this story not as a warning, but as a mirror. Because if you've ever been the reliable one, the calm one, the person who handles things, there may come a moment when something small asks you a big question. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a simple choice. And whatever you choose in that moment will teach the system exactly who you are. So I'll leave you with this. No judgment, no instruction, just curiosity. Have you ever stayed quiet to keep things stable and later realized the stability was costing you more than you knew? If you have, I'd like to hear how that moment showed up for you.